And believe it or not, I've had a couple who did not know that I do not want a hard copy. I want to see it on Turnitin. Now, unless you want me to look at it, and that's the time for that is past after the day, but I want to see it on Turnitin.com. Two reasons for that. Number one is it's less paperwork and less clutter. That's really number two. Reason number one is it tends to deter plagiarism. Turnitin is excellent in catching plagiarism, and usually I don't have a problem with it. Most students realize that if they copy and paste something from Wikipedia, they're going to get caught, purely and simply. So, all right. Having said that, what is the topic, folk? Every sentence I utter can be a topic. Practically every sentence. Yes?
What is the percentage you
Okay, about the Turnitin percentage, let me tell you something, folks. I had one student last fall who was just terribly upset. She had a 12% plagiarism on her Turnitin. 12%, quite honestly, I don't care. Yeah, I don't really get alarmed about getting past 50%. 12% is nothing.
Woo! All right.
12%, let me tell you something. When I see a plagiarism count of 0, it shows originality on it, but I sometimes will bypass that and look at another one because I dread grading it. Why? Because a plagiarism count of 0 usually is written by a student who doesn't write the English language very well, and the grammar is extremely poor, and the corrections are going to take extremely long to make. And in other words, the plagiarism count should be anywhere from 5 to 20%. I mean, just because you can't, it's hard to say something that's really supremely original. So 12%, and she was so, I copied, I did a direct quote, yeah, fine, do a direct quote. If you do one, you're going to get a little bit of a higher plagiarism count, but not, nothing out of the ordinary. So don't worry about it, unless, now when you get past, if you get up to 70%, I say so on the syllabus. At some point I have to say you either do this over or take knock points off the grade. And I forget exactly the word, but I do say on the syllabus what I consider high. But it's not 15 to 20%. I mean, I don't care, yes.
Do we have to register for your class on that Turnitin?
You certainly do, and we'll look weirdly enough, only about 2 or 3 of you had as of last Saturday. I looked it up, about 2, but see, I was concerned about it because when nobody can register, that means I've made a mistake. But if everybody else can register except you, but anyway, when people can register, but you do have to register for this class on Turnitin. The instructions are on the syllabus, and apparently they're right because the fact is 2 or 3 of you had registered as of Saturday. Now, if any of you have turned your paper in, you've turned it in since Saturday, because I looked Saturday and any of you, well, I don't need a show of hands. I know who's turned them in when I look at it. Hopefully tomorrow. All right. Anyway, any other questions? That was a good question. Glad you asked. Any other questions? All right. Then, in that case, I'll get started. A couple things that I've missed saying in the last class. This is something that just hit me as I was riding along yesterday. I have mentioned several times that a lot of the gold in Europe found its way to China. Now, fast forward to 21st century America. Where's America's wealth right now?
The size of our army.
In China. In the Army, a lot of America's wealth, unfortunately, is in China.
I thought we just owed them money. I didn't think we'd actually paid them anything.
Well, they bought up our debt. They said, hey, I thought most every one of my students, believe it or not, seems to know that. Well, does history repeat itself? In other words, now, the rumor has it that China has gotten a lot of our gold and made a lot of gold and stored it away. In Roman times, China collected Europe's gold and held it for 1,000 years. So, in other words, are there any parallel? Now, here's another parallel. When the Mongolians defeated the Chinese, the Mongolians used gunpowder. Guess who had given the Mongolians the weapons? The Chinese. In other words, China taught Mongolia the use of gunpowder, Mongolia turned that use on the Chinese and defeated the Chinese. Now, at the moment, until 2014, the United States gave its enemies the weapons that the enemies have now turned and used against us. Many of you are familiar with this. I mean, maybe you've heard this from other sources, but these people that are fighting us now, fighting against what we believe, would not have any weaponry had they not gotten the weaponry from, ultimately, most of it from the United States. A point I did make to the other class the other Monday, but I didn't make it this class. Something else too, I get in my car all the time and say, whoops, I forgot this. I wanted to back up the beginning, the first part of the chapter, temporarily. The Han Dynasty we talked about in chapter 5. That was the dynasty that lasted some hundreds of years. After that, China plunged into a period they called the Age of Chaos, or the era of 6 dynasties, where there was no dynasty in charge. Now, folk, hopefully by now you know my thinking on this. What caused the era of chaos? I mean, all right, let me back up a bit. The same thing was going on in Europe, where the Roman Empire collapsed. In China, the Chinese collapsed. What do I think was the big cause of all the collapse? India collapsed also. What was the cause?
Climate change.
Climate change in the form of global, at least northern hemisphere, cooling. We don't know what's going on in the south here. It's hard to tell, but it appears that the climate change was a cooling that almost ended civilization here in Europe, divided China, and paralyzed India for about 1,000 years. India was not to recover for centuries. In the case of China, their downfall only lasted about 400 years. Europe's lasted from about 700 years to about 1100 when Europe had the Renaissance. China's Renaissance began around the year 600 or so. You can't assign real dates to these things, but you get the idea of the time period. These dynasties, I want you to know, the Han you should already have learned from chapter 5. 6 dynasties. In other words, there actually were a lot more, but they would come and go and come and go, and none of them really had charge. Then came the Tang dynasty that did a lot, the Song, and finally the Yuan. Now, something I did not mention about, too, also, under the Tang dynasty, the Tang dynasty practiced what we might call redistribution of land. In other words, a problem has occurred throughout the history of agrarian peoples. Land tends to be lost and find its way in the hands of a few rich. Well, the Tang dynasty took this extra land from the rich and redistributed this land among the poor. If you know me at all, you know what I'm about to say. And of course, your book says the same thing. It didn't work. Temporarily, it brought about prosperity, but inevitably, one at a time, the rich were able to buy back the lands that had been taken from them. And eventually, the poor found themselves landless again, and the rich had all the land, and the poor were reduced. Why does this happen? Well, disaster can befall. Several things can impoverish a person. You might become crippled and unable to work. You might get hurt in war. Disease might come and strike a family and take away 3 or 4 of its strongest men. Or, a lot of times, it's due to bad judgments and bad decisions, investments that go bad. Sometimes you just simply can't help it. Disasters will befall you in spite of every attempt you make to avoid them. And you have to sell your land to a rich neighbor, and he winds up buying your land and the neighbor's land and other land. After a while, the rich have all the land again, and the poor are left with nothing. There's an old saying, folk, and unfortunately there's a lot of truth in it. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I think most, have any of you heard that from outside? All right, several hands went up. Well, yeah. And folk, throughout history, there has been a lot of truth in that. just to remind you how important these civil service exams were, your book devotes one whole page to it. Whole lot of info on the civil service exam, which you need to look at. And something else your book points out to, numerous times, the Chinese have been overrun by nomadic invaders, particularly Mongolians or Manchurians, people from the north who would swoop down. And in almost every, I believe in every case, the Chinese actually outnumbered their enemy. But your enemy was able to win because they had more determination and more of a will to fight. And the Chinese would be overpowered by enemies. In the case of Genghis Khan came in, he never had more than 130,000 men at the most. That's according to your book now, those of you who read the book. 130,000 men at the most. And China had, we don't know how many people, maybe 40 or 50 million people. How could Genghis Khan conquer millions of people? Well, the answer is the millions of people were not willing to fight, could not organize themselves to fight. The barbaric people like the Mongolians. Again, your book tells how that the Song dynasty became weaker and weaker. In spite of being prosperous, they were finally forced to pay tribute to the Manchuria people. Then they formed an alliance with the Mongolians, and this proved to be a disaster. A big disaster. The Mongolians came in and overtook them. Now, about the Mongolians, we're going to have more to say about them later in the chapter when we come to page 283, Genghis Khan. For the moment, though, your book digresses and starts talking about the religious conflict that was going on. There's a whole lot of parallelism in history. In Europe, you had a fight going on between the pagans and the Christians, in which Christianity won out. And later, you would have a fight between the Catholics and Protestants, which resulted in Europe being divided religiously between Catholic and Protestants. In India, had a struggle between Hindu and Buddhist, with Buddhism appearing to triumph first and Hinduism. In China, you had a struggle between Confucianism on the one hand, and Taoism and Buddhism on the other. I've written those names down before. So. And it looked for a while like Buddhism was going to triumph because it was more spiritual. However, the Confucians realized the weakness of their religion, just like in India, the Hindus realized the weakness of their religion. So they made their religion more spiritual, and the new Confucianism, called Neo-Confucianism, that came out was not like the Confucianism that Confucius had originally started. Called it Neo-Confucianism, but it was much more spiritual, and with a more spiritual Confucianism, it put aside Buddhism and Taoism. They're still in China, but they became the lesser religion, and Confucianism, or Neo-Confucianism, became the state religion. All right. Okay, for those of you trying to follow in the book, I've turned to page 276. I think I picked up one of the loose ends. And I want to emphasize here some of the things that the Chinese did that made them almost take over, well, in a position to take over the whole globe.